Millhaven, Montana. Territory. October 1883. The train arrived 20 minutes late, which was better than most days in October, when the high passes filled with early snow and the locomotives ground their way through the mountains like old men climbing stairs. The platform at Millhaven was not much to speak of: a strip of weathered planking, a tin-roofed shelter that leaked at both ends, and a hand-painted sign that had lost its second L somewhere around 1879, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it since. Millhaven, Montana. Population 412 if you counted the Gar family out on the eastern ridge, which most people did when they remembered and forgot when they didn't. Seth Calloway was standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands and a photograph in his shirt pocket. He was 36 years old and looked 42, the way men do when they have spent 2 years trying to hold up a world that keeps getting heavier. 6 feet and something over broad across the shoulders, from 2 decades of fence work and cattle, with a jaw that had been set against difficulty for so long it had simply stayed that way. He was not an unkind man. Everyone in Millhaven would have told you that if you asked. He was not cruel, not dishonest, not given to drink or meanness. He was simply a man who had lost too much in too short a time and had not yet found his footing again. His father, Gerald Calloway, had died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1881, face down in the mud of the south fence line with one hand still gripping the post he'd been trying to mend. His heart had given out with the abruptness of a snapped wire. No warning, no goodbye. Just there, and then not there, the way the most important things always went. Since then, Seth had been running the Calloway ranch alone with only Rupert Hatch. Roop, as everyone called him, a 58-year-old man made of saddle leather and stubbornness and 2 hired hands, who came and went with the seasons. He had written to the Chicago matrimonial agency 6 months ago at the suggestion of the Methodist minister, who had pointed out with uncomfortable directness that a man running 400 acres alone was not running them well. Seth had written 2 drafts of the letter, thrown them both in the fire, and then written a third one straight through without stopping, on the grounds that thinking about it too hard had not improved the first 2 attempts. He had written, "I am 36 years old. I have land, a house, and enough cattle to make a living if the weather cooperates, which it does not always do. I work hard. I am not a talker. I will not waste your time with pretty words I don't mean. I am looking for a steady woman who means to stay. If you are that woman, write back." Someone had written back. Her name was Maren Vass. She was 28 years old, a seamstress from Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a German immigrant who had come to America with $20 and a trade, and had built something real with both. She had written with the same directness Seth had used, which he had taken as a good sign. Her letters were practical. They discussed the reality of ranch life without flinching, asked reasonable questions about the winters and the nearest town and whether there was a church, and offered reasonable answers when Seth asked questions in return. 6 months of letters. He had built up a picture in his mind the way a man will, filling in the spaces between words with what he wanted to see. He had not thought much about what she looked like. He told himself that later. He was not sure it was entirely true. The train doors opened, people descended. A man with a carpet bag, a woman in gray with 2 small children, a cattle buyer Seth recognized from Billings. And then, near the last car, a woman who stepped down onto the platform with a leather valise in one hand and a worn envelope in the other, and who looked nothing at all like the image Seth had been constructing in his mind for half a year. Maren Vass was not small. She was not the slight, gentle figure he had somehow pictured, despite the fact that her letters had never once described herself that way. She was a large woman, solidly built, with dark hair pinned back practically under a traveling hat that had seen better years, and brown eyes that took in the platform, the town beyond it, and Seth Calloway standing with his hat in his hands, all in one single unhurried assessment. Seth took the photograph from his pocket. He looked at it. He looked at her. The photograph was from the agency. It did not match. And then in front of Amos Trell, the sheriff, and Mrs. Calder from the boarding house, and Arlo Finch from the mercantile, and approximately 37 other residents of Millhaven who had found reasons to be near the train platform that afternoon, Seth Calloway said 4 words. "There's been a mistake." The platform went very quiet. Not the quiet of people minding their own business, but the particular attentive quiet of people who have decided this is worth hearing. Maren did not flinch. She did not color or look away, or press her lips together in the way of a woman trying not to cry in public. She set her valise down on the platform boards with the deliberate care of someone who has decided not to hurry. And she looked at Seth Calloway with those level brown eyes, and she said with a voice that was steadier than the situation had any right to produce, "You wrote for a steady woman, Mr. Calloway. I am standing in front of you. That is the only fact that matters right now." Nobody laughed. The quiet got quieter. Seth's jaw worked. He was not a man who lost words often, but he lost them then. He stood there with his hat in his hands, and his photograph and his 4 words hanging in the October air between them, and he had no follow-up. It was Mrs. Calder who eventually moved, stepping forward with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been managing awkward situations for 30 years and had no patience for letting them fester. She introduced herself. She offered the boarding house. She said something about supper, and the crowd denied its scene dispersed with the reluctant slowness of people who feel they have been cheated of something. Seth carried Maren's valise to the boarding house. He did not offer an apology. He was not ready for it yet. He said she would be comfortable there, and that they would speak in the morning, and Maren said simply that she would be there, and the door closed between them. Seth walked back to where he'd left his wagon in the sound of the wind off the mountains and the particular silence of a man who knows he has behaved badly and is not yet sure what to do about it. Inside the boarding house, a girl of about 16 with sharp eyes and quick hands brought a supper tray to Maren's room. Her name was Blythe. She set the tray down and stood for a moment in the doorway with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether a stranger is worth talking to. "I'm sorry about the platform," Blythe said finally. "That wasn't right." "No," Maren agreed. "It wasn't." Blythe glanced down the hallway, then back. "He's not a cruel man, whatever it looked like." Maren was unpacking her valise with the methodical efficiency of someone who had packed and unpacked in a great many rooms over the years. "What is he, then?" Blythe considered. "Tired," she said at last, "and scared, though he'd never say that out loud. Woman came before you 2 years back when his father first got sick. She took one look at the work the ranch needed and got back on the train before the week was out." She paused. "Broke something in him." Maren folded a blouse and set it in the drawer. "What do you know about a man named Druce?" Blythe's face changed. Not dramatically, she was too careful for that, but something shifted behind her eyes, a wariness pulling across her expression like a curtain being drawn. "Why do you ask?" "Because Mr. Calloway mentioned him this afternoon. Because the way he said the name told me something." Maren turned to look at the girl directly. "And because I've been a seamstress for 9 years, which means I've spent 9 years learning to read what's underneath the surface of things." Blythe was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped further into the room and lowered her voice. Franklin Druce owned the Millhaven Territorial Bank. He owned it in the way that some men own things in small towns. Not just the building and the vault, but the debts of half the merchants on the main street and a good portion of the ranchers in the surrounding county. He had come to Millhaven 8 years ago with Eastern money and Eastern manners, and had made himself indispensable in the way that a stone wedged in a door frame becomes indispensable. You forget it was ever placed there deliberately, and you only notice it when someone tries to remove it. Since Gerald Calloway's death 2 years ago, Druce had been pressing a claim against the ranch. A loan, he said. $3,000, secured against the Calloway land signed by Gerald 4 years before his death. He had documents. He had a notary seal. He had the patience of a man who knows that time works in his favor, because a grieving son running 400 acres alone cannot also afford lawyers and court filings without eventually running out of one or the other. Seth had never seen the original document. Gerald had never mentioned it, And Seth knew his father knew the particular kind of man he was, which was the kind who did not sign papers without keeping copies and did not borrow money without telling his family. But knowing and proving were different animals, as Roop had said more than once, in the way that Roop said difficult things, which was plainly and without ornament. Blythe told Marin what she knew, which was most of this. She told it quickly in the low voice of someone practiced at carrying information carefully. When she was done, Marin sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the worn envelope in her lap. Seth's letters, all 6 months of them folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. She had read those letters on the train from Columbus. She had read them a dozen times before that. And she knew with the particular certainty of a woman who has spent her adult life reading surfaces for what lies underneath them that the man who had written those letters, careful, plain honest, to the point of bluntness, was not the son of a man who would borrow $3,000 and leave no trace of it. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning, Seth came to the boarding house before 7. He stood in Mrs. Calder's parlor with his hat in his hands. He was always doing that with his hat. Marin noticed a gesture not of nervousness exactly, but of effort, as though he was actively trying to hold himself in a posture of patience, and he looked at her directly, this time without the photograph. "I owe you an apology," he said. "What I said on that platform was unkind. I had built up a picture in my head over 6 months, and when you stepped off that train, you weren't it. And instead of thinking before I spoke, I just spoke. That was wrong." He met her eyes steadily when he said it. Marin had encountered a great many apologies in her 28 years and had learned to sort them from a distance, the ones that were really appeals for reassurance dressed up as contrition, the ones that were performances for observers, and the rare ones that were simply true. This one was simply true. "I accept it," she said. His shoulders loosened slightly, the way shoulders do when a weight comes off. "Does that mean you'll stay?" "That depends," Marin said, "on whether you can look at me. Not almost, not nearly, directly the way you're doing right now." "I'm looking. You're trying. There's still a difference." She said it without cruelty. "Give it time. It will come." Something close to a smile moved across his face, brief and surprised. "You don't make it easy." "I've had a lifetime of people talking around things instead of through them," Marin said. "I find it doesn't serve anyone." He nodded slowly. "There's something you need to know before you decide anything." He told her about Druce. He told her more than Blythe had told her, because he'd been living with it for 2 years, and it had pressed into him like a stone in a boot. Franklin Druce and the document, and the $3,000, and the 30-day notices that kept coming like weather. He told her about his father, Gerald, who had kept every receipt he'd ever written, who had a ledger for each year going back to 1869, who had said more than once that a handshake was fine for friends and worthless for bankers. He told her that he knew in his bones the loan was a lie, and that knowing it and proving it were not the same thing. Marin listened to all of it without interrupting. This, she had learned, was a skill most people underestimated. Listening is not simply the absence of talking. It is an active practice of attention, of noting not just what is said, but what is held back, what costs something to say, what the speaker cannot quite bring themselves to name. When Seth was done, she said, "Is there a study? Somewhere your father kept his papers." Seth blinked. "Back of the house." "Why?" "Because a man who kept every receipt for 20 years didn't stop because someone handed him a large sum of money. He kept a record. If the loan is real, there'll be something in his hand to confirm it. If it isn't, that absence is its own kind of evidence." She paused. "Either way, I'd like to see what your father actually wrote before I try to judge what someone else claims he wrote." Seth looked at her for a moment with an expression she would come to know well. A particular recalibration, the face of a man updating a picture that wasn't matching the evidence. Roop, who had appeared in the doorway of the parlor sometime during Seth's account and had been standing there with his arms folded and his expression professionally neutral, let out a low breath that might have been impressed. "She's already working," he said. "She surely is," Seth said. They were married 2 days later in the Methodist church at the edge of town. Blythe as witness, Roop beside Seth. Mrs. Calder in the back pew with her arms folded and her expression suggesting she had not yet determined whether to be scandalized or satisfied. Maren wore the deep blue wool she had made herself every seam precise because precision was how she did things when it mattered. Seth wore his father's coat. It was too broad in the shoulders even for him, which told Maren something about Gerald Calloway that she filed away with everything else she was learning. The minister moved quickly. Ranch weddings were not long affairs. When it was done and they stepped out of the church into the thin October sunlight, a man was waiting on the boardwalk, 50 or so, with a kind of stillness that was not ease but control. A tailored coat from somewhere east of here, a gold watch chain, a smile that arrived at precisely the right moment and departed just as precisely, like something operated by a mechanism rather than genuine feeling. His eyes moved over Maren with the flat assessment of a man who has decided before looking that what he sees will not be important. "Caleb," and then catching himself, "Seth, forgive me, old habit." He turned the smile toward Maren, and this would be the new Mrs. Calloway. "Welcome to Millhaven, ma'am. I do hope your husband has told you about the difficulties facing the ranch." "That's enough, Druce." Seth's voice had gone flat and careful, only being neighborly. Franklin Druce reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, holding it out at a distance that allowed them to see it clearly, but not to read it. The particular gesture of a man who wants you to know he holds something without letting you examine it too closely. "The bank holds this, signed by your father 4 years ago. A loan that was never repaid. I've been patient out of respect for Gerald, but patience has its limits." He tucked it away before either of them could reach for it. "There was no loan," Seth said. "My father never borrowed against that land. The paper says otherwise." Maren stepped forward. The movement was unhurried the way her movements generally were. She was a woman who had learned not to waste energy on urgency before urgency was necessary. She held out her hand. "May I see the document, Mr. Druce?" The smile flickered. Something moved behind it that came and went too fast to name. "It's bank property, Mrs. Calloway. Filed properly. You'll see it soon enough when it's filed against your husband's deed." "Then I'll see it then," Maren said. Her hand came down unhurried. "And I'll be looking closely. 9 years matching thread to thread teaches you to see what doesn't line up. Ink and paper aren't so different once you know where to look." The smile dropped. Not for long. Druce was too practiced for that. But it dropped, and what was underneath was not the confident amusement of a man who expects to win. It was something tighter and faster and considerably less comfortable. "Congratulations on your marriage." He said the courtesy back in place, but thinner now, a coat pulled on in a hurry. He tipped his hat. "I'll be in touch, Seth, soon." He walked away. Unhurried, but the click of his boots on the boardwalk was faster than his pace suggested it should be. Seth watched him go, then turned to Maren. "You saw that?" "I saw it." "He didn't expect you to ask." "No," Maren said. "Men like Druce count on people staying quiet and small." He looked at me and saw someone he didn't have to account for. She climbed into the wagon without waiting for his hand, not out of coldness, but out of habit, the long habit of a woman who has learned not to expect assistance for ordinary things. He's about to learn different. Seth climbed up beside her and took the reins. And, for the first time since she had stepped off the train at Millhaven, he laughed short and startled and completely real. The Calloway ranch house sat low and long against the gray-gold plain. A good house once solid-boned, a fine stone hearth and windows set deep in thick walls. But the porch sagged on the west end, a shutter hung from a single hinge, and the barn beyond it carried the look of a structure that had been maintained rather than cared for the way things look when one person has been doing the work of 3 for 2 years straight. Maren walked through it slowly, making no comment and no judgment, the way she had once assessed bolts of damaged cloth, not with criticism, but with the clear-eyed inventory of a woman already calculating what the work would require. The study was off the back hall. Gerald Calloway's room. Clearly no one had changed it since his death, which meant no one had been able to. His presence was still in the way the books were arranged, alphabetical within each shelf, and by subject across them, the way the lamp was positioned at exactly the right angle for a right-handed man. The way the blotter on the desk was precisely centered, despite 2 years of no one sitting there. Maren sat down at it without asking. She opened the first ledger. She sat there for 3 hours. Gerald Calloway had kept meticulous records. Every transaction for 22 years, each one in the same careful hand. Each one with the date, the amount, the purpose, and where applicable, a notation of the receipt number filed behind it. He had a system for his receipts numbered in order by year, and he had stuck to it with the consistency of a man who genuinely believed that accurate records were a form of integrity and not merely a convenience. There were no gaps, no years where the records became sparse or confused. No periods where large amounts appeared without clear accounting. And there was no loan from Franklin Druce's bank, not in 1879, which was the date on the document Druce had produced, not in any other year. There was regular mortgage correspondence with a Billings bank for the North Pasture, meticulously recorded and matching to the cent. There was nothing else. Maren turned back to 1879 and sat very still. Something else. She had almost missed it. In 1879, Gerald Calloway had engaged Aldous Pryor, a lawyer, then practicing in Mill Haven, to draw up his will. The reference to it was in Gerald's own hand, noted in the margin of the April ledger entry, with the care of a man cross-referencing his own life, will finalized. Pryor, April 14th. Full accounting of all assets and encumbrances completed and filed. Full accounting, April, 1879. The document Druce held was dated July of that same year. Maren set down the ledger and looked at the far wall for a moment, at the shelf of books and the lamp and the blotter centered with such care on the old desk. A man who had a full legal accounting of his assets made in April did not then sign an undisclosed loan for $3,000 in July of the same year. Not a man like Gerald Calloway, who tracked every dollar and filed every receipt and notated his own will preparation in the household accounts. The loan had not been signed in 1879, which meant it had not been signed at all, which meant the document Druce was holding had not been written when it said it had been written. It was late when Seth appeared in the doorway of the study. He looked at the ledgers spread across the desk, at Maren sitting in his father's chair with her hands folded over the open pages, and he waited. "Your father had his will drawn up in April of 1879, she said. "Full accounting of all assets and debts. His own notation." Seth came into the room. He sat in the chair across from the desk, the one Gerald had probably used for visitors, and he looked at his father's handwriting under the lamp. "The loan is dated July of the same year," Maren continued. 3 months after a full legal accounting that, if the loan existed, would have to include it. Seth was very still. "A man like your father does not have a complete accounting of his debts made in April," she said. "And then 3 months later sign a loan large enough to threaten 400 acres without entering it in his own records, without keeping a copy, and without mentioning it to his son or his lawyer." She paused. "The loan didn't exist in 1879 because it didn't exist at all. That document was created after your father died." The silence in the study was the particular silence of something important settling into place. "You're certain," Seth said, "not a challenge, a need." "I'm certain enough to want to prove it." Maren closed the ledger carefully, the way she handled all things that mattered. Believing gets you nowhere in a courtroom. Proving does. That night, Sheriff Amos Trell came to the ranch with the official notice. 30 days. The bank's claim filed with the court. Seth's face, when he read it, was the controlled face of a man who was furious underneath and had decided not to show it, which Maren had already learned was how Seth Calloway handled things he hadn't yet found a way through. She took the document from him and held it up to the lamp. What she saw made something settle in her chest. Not relief, because this was far from over, but certainty, which was its own kind of steadiness. The ink was wrong, not subtly wrong, not possibly wrong in the specific observable way that she recognized from years of examining thread and cloth and dye. Real ink, 4 years old, sitting in paper that had been exposed to light and air, and the dry heat of a Montana winter would show the changes that time always leaves. Fading at the edges. The faint feathering of pigment absorbed into paper grain. The particular brownish quality of iron gall ink as it oxidized slowly across years. This ink was black, uniformly perfectly black. The black of ink that had been on paper for months, not years. Someone had written this document recently, sealed it, notarized it, and she would want to know more about that notary when there was time. And then produced it as though it had been lying in a bank vault since 1879. "Sheriff," she said, and Trell looked at her with the patient wariness of a man who has been a sheriff long enough to be surprised by nothing and still occasionally surprised. "This ink is not 4 years old." Trell frowned. "Ma'am, I've spent the afternoon reading Gerald Calloway's actual ledgers. Genuine entries from 4 and 5 and 6 years ago. The ink on those has faded the way old ink fades brownish at the edges absorbed into the paper, in the way ink behaves when it's been sitting for years." She tilted the document toward the lamp so Trell could see for himself. "This is black straight through. No fading, no feathering into the paper grain. This was written recently." Trell took the document back. He held it up himself, frowning at it with a new attention that had not been there 30 seconds ago. "I'm not an expert in ink," he said carefully. "No," Marin agreed. "But there are experts in Helena who are. Document examiners, men who study ink composition and paper aging and handwriting under magnification as a professional practice. I'd ask the court to send this for examination before any deed transfers on the strength of it." Trell looked at the document, then at her, then at Seth, who was watching the exchange with something kindling in his face that had not been there an hour ago. "That's," Trell said slowly, "not unreasonable." He tucked the document away with considerably more care than he'd brought it out with. "I'll note your objection. A request for examination is a fair thing to bring before Judge Marsh." He left. The three of them, Seth, Maran, Rupa, stood in the doorway and watched the dark take him. "How did you know that?" Seth said, finally turning to her. "About the ink." "I didn't know it exactly," Marin said. "I noticed it." She moved back toward the house, back toward the study, and the task still waiting there. 9 years of matching thread color to thread color teaches you to see what doesn't match. The ink didn't match what I saw in your father's ledgers. That's all I knew for certain." "That's a great deal," Seth said quietly. Rupe said nothing, which, for Rupe, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Later, when the house had gone quiet, and Seth was at the desk writing the first of what would be many letters to lawyers and courts and specialists. In Helena, Marin sat by the window in the small room that had been a storage room and was now, with 2 days of her attention, something approaching livable. She looked out at the Montana dark, vast and clear and absolute, in a way that the Ohio dark had never been. And she thought about Franklin Druce's face outside the church. The way the smile had dropped for a single unguarded second when she held out her hand and asked to see the document. He had not expected her to ask. He had looked at her and calculated the way men like Druce always calculated, seeing only the surface, the size, the worn traveling clothes, the woman who had just been publicly rejected on a train platform. And he had decided she was not a variable he needed to account for. She had spent 28 years watching people make that calculation. She had spent 28 years knowing what came next for the ones who made it. They found out they were wrong. Outside, the October wind came down off the mountains in the way that Rupa had told her it always did, like something that had decided to come and was not going to be argued with. The pines moved against the dark sky. The ranch lay quiet around the house, waiting for whatever was coming. Marin Vass Calloway, 28 years old, seamstress, wife of 11 days, looked out at the Montana dark and began to think very carefully about the next move. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She was not afraid of that. The morning after Sheriff Trell's visit, Marin was up before the sun. Not because she couldn't sleep, though that was also true, but because the ranch had a rhythm and she had decided on her first full day as Mrs. Calloway that she was going to learn it the way she learned everything, by showing up early and paying attention until it made sense. Rupe was already in the yard when she came out doing something methodical to a piece of harness in the gray pre-dawn light. He didn't look up when she appeared on the porch, but she had already begun to understand that Rupe's silences were not indifference. They were assessment. He was watching everything. He simply preferred not to let on. She went to the kitchen and built the fire herself. Mrs. Dolan, the cook. Gerald had hired in his last years a stout, wordless woman of about 60 who wore the same gray apron every day and communicated primarily through the quality of what she put on. The table appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later and stood looking at Marin with an expression that was not quite welcome and not quite hostility, but something carefully positioned between the two. Marin did not explain herself. She simply moved aside to make room at the stove and kept working. That was day 4. By day 6, Mrs. Dolan had begun leaving the good cast-iron pan out where Marin could reach it without asking. It was, Marin understood, as close to approval as the woman was likely to come, and she accepted it as such. The ranch itself was in the condition that 2 years of one man's best efforts could produce, which was to say, functional in the ways that mattered most and neglected in the ways that could be deferred. The cattle were healthy. The fences along the north pasture were sound. But the house leaked cold from 3 windows whose frames had warped in the last hard winter. The porch boards needed replacing before someone went through one, and the kitchen garden behind the house had gone to seed and frost without anyone having the time or the heart to do anything about it. Marin worked through all of it with the same focused patience she had brought to the study on her first night. She sealed the windows with strips of cloth cut from a bolt she found in the bottom of a storage trunk. She replaced 2 porch boards herself with Rupe watching from the yard with an expression that shifted over the course of an hour from skepticism to something approaching respect. She could not do anything about the kitchen garden until spring, but she cleared it and turned the soil and noted what would need to be planted and when. Seth watched all of this with the same recalibrating expression she had already seen on his face, twice the look of a man discovering that the picture he'd been working with was less complete than he thought. He did not say much about it, but he stopped reaching past her to do things she was already doing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. On day 5, Marin put on her second-best dress and walked into Millhaven alone. She needed thread, which was true. She needed buttons for the new curtains she was cutting from the bolt of good blue cloth at the bottom of her trunk, which was also true. But she had learned in 28 years of being a woman in rooms where people had already decided what she was that ordinary errands were the best possible cover for paying attention. A large woman buying buttons in a mercantile was invisible. A large woman buying buttons in a mercantile and listening was something else entirely. Arlo Finch's mercantile smelled of coffee and leather and the particular dry dust of a building that had been storing goods for a long time. Finch himself was a thin man in his early 40s with ink-stained fingers and the careful eyes of someone who has learned to notice things without appearing to. He matched Marin's thread with practiced efficiency, pulling spools from the shelf behind him without needing to look. Marin let the silence sit for a moment, examining a bolt of brown wool with the focused attention of someone genuinely considering it. "I understand Mr. Druce's bank handles most of the accounts in town," she said conversationally, the way one notes the weather. Finch's hands did not stop moving, but his shoulders tightened by a fraction of an inch. "Most everyone's, yes, ma'am. Including yours." A pause. Brief. "Mercantile's note runs through Druce's bank. Has for 6 years. That must be convenient," Marin said. "Or difficult, depending on the month." Finch set the thread spools on the counter and looked at her. Then the way a man looks when he is deciding whether a stranger can be trusted with something that costs something to say. He was quiet for long enough that Marin thought he had decided against it. Then, very quietly, "Some months he's patient, Some months a man finds his note called due with no notice and has to scramble to keep his doors open. He glanced toward the front window. "You're the new Mrs. Calloway. I heard what you did outside the church." "I asked to see a document," Marin said. "Yes, ma'am." Something moved in Finch's face, not quite a smile. The shadow of one briefly before caution pulled it back. "There's a man, used to practice law here in Millhaven years back, before Druce ruined him." He lowered his voice further. "Name's Aldous Pryor. Lives out past the old mill now. Keeps to himself. Folks say he's bitter as turned milk about what happened." A pause. "He drew up Gerald Calloway's will. If anyone knows what Gerald's finances looked like in 1879, it'd be him." Marin did not write it down. She did not need to. "What happened to Pryor exactly?" Finch was quiet for a moment. "Then, he represented a small rancher in a boundary dispute against one of Druce's early land acquisitions. Won the case, fair and square from everything anyone could tell." He straightened the thread spools unnecessarily. "Within 2 years, every client Pryor had found other counsel. Every debt he owed was called in. His wife left for her sister's place back east." He met Marin's eyes. Man lost his whole life because he won one case against the wrong person. Marin paid for her thread and buttons. At the door, she paused. "Thank you, Mr. Finch." "Don't thank me yet, ma'am," he said. His voice had gone serious in a way it hadn't been before. "A lot of people in this town have been hoping for someone to do what you're doing. A lot of us have learned not to hope too hard. Hope is expensive around here, same as everything else Druce has his hand on." She walked out into the October sunlight and turned toward the edge of town, where the old mill road ran north between stands of bare-branched cottonwood. On the way back, Blythe caught up with her on the road, breathless, her bonnet knocked sideways from hurrying. She had overheard something at the boarding house. 2 men talking in the back parlor that morning, voices low. Druce had sent someone to Helena on the fast coach 2 days before. She hadn't heard why, but the man rode with his hat pulled down and said nothing to anyone the whole way. Marin filed that detail in the same place she filed everything and kept walking. The cabin past the mill was small but maintained with the particular care of a man who has lost most things and is holding on tightly to what remains. A woodpile stacked with geometric precision, a porch swept clean, a window with good curtains. Which Marin noticed the way she always noticed curtains. The fabric was worn, but the seams were straight, the work of someone who had done it properly despite reduced circumstances. Aldous Pryor came to the door before they knocked. He was 62 years old and looked like someone had taken a larger man and removed from him piece by piece everything that wasn't essential. Lean, gray-bearded, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a posture that had once been upright and was now something more considered the posture of a man who had decided that standing straight was an act of will rather than ease. He looked at Seth, then at Marin. His gaze on Marin was the assessing kind, not unkind but direct in the way of someone who no longer has the patience for pretense. "Brennan's boy," he said to Seth, then caught himself. "Calloway, forgive me. I knew your grandfather before your father." "Arlo Finch sent us," Marin said. Something shifted in Pryor's eyes. "Finch," he said with the particular tone of a man encountering an unexpected act of courage from someone he'd given up expecting it from. "Come in, then." Inside the cabin was lined with law books that had not been opened in years. You could tell by the dust on the tops of the pages and stacked with papers that clearly had been recently organized with the desperate energy of a man who had not had reason to organize them in a long time and was now doing so on the chance that reason might arrive. He had drawn up Gerald Calloway's will in April of 1879. He confirmed this without needing to check his records, which told Marin he had been thinking about Gerald since the moment Seth's trouble became known around town, which told her something about the kind of man Aldous Pryor actually was underneath the bitterness. "Full accounting," he said. "Every asset, every debt, every legal encumbrance on that land. It's what a proper will requires, and Gerald was the kind of man who wanted it done properly." He looked at his hands. There was no loan from Druce's bank, none. If there had been, I would have been required by law to account for it. I didn't, because it didn't exist. The silence in the small cabin was the silence of something important being confirmed. "Will you testify to that?" Marin asked. Pryor was quiet for the long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant water. "Testifying against Druce in this territory," he said finally, "is an efficient way to lose whatever I've managed to hold on to. He ruined me once." His voice carried the flatness of old pain. "I watched my wife pack a trunk. I watched clients I'd served honestly for 15 years cross the street rather than be seen near me. You don't know what that costs." "No," Marin said. "I don't know that particular cost." She held his gaze. "But I know what it is to walk into a room and have people decide before you've said a word that you're not worth their attention. I know what it is to be looked at and calculated and dismissed. It's not the same wound as yours, but I understand something about what it takes to keep standing up anyway." Something moved across Pryor's weathered face. A recognition slow and reluctant and genuine. "Your father helped me," he said, turning to Seth, "after Druce finished with me. When half this town wouldn't look me in the eye for fear of catching whatever Druce had decided I had, Gerald Calloway still tipped his hat to me on the street. Still nodded like I was a man worth nodding to." His jaw worked. "I owe that man something. I expect I always have." "Then help us," Seth said quietly. Pryor looked out the window at the cottonwoods for a long moment. "I'll write the affidavit," he said at last. "Everything I know sworn and notarized. There's still a notary in Harlan County who isn't beholden to Druce. I'll see to it personally." He turned back to them, and the spark in his eyes was the spark of a man remembering something he thought he had lost. "But my word proves no loan existed in my accounting. It doesn't prove Druce's document is forged. For that you need an examiner." "Dr. Silas Oram," Marin said. Pryor looked at her sharply. "You know that name? I read it in a newspaper of Mrs. Calder's. He testified in a forgery case in Helena last year. Document examiner. Specific reputation for independence." She paused. "I keep things I might need later." Pryor studied her for a moment. Then something that might have been the distant ancestor of a smile moved across his face. "You'll need the original document. An examiner worth anything won't work from a copy. The sheriff has it, filed with the court. Then you petition the court for access. As the defendant in the claim, you have the right to have it examined before any hearing. Druce can't refuse that without making himself look exactly as guilty as he is." Pryor was already moving toward the small writing desk in the corner of the cabin, already pulling out paper. His hands, Marin noticed, had stopped their slight tremor. "I'll draft the petition myself." He paused with the pen in his hand and looked up. "It's been 6 years since I drafted anything that mattered," he said. "Not with self-pity, with something closer to wonder. I find I still remember how." On the ride back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Seth was quiet for a long time. The wagon wheels found the ruts in the road, and the horses kept their steady pace, and the sky above the mountains went from gray to the particular deep blue that comes just before full dark. "You found him in one afternoon," Seth said finally. "Arlo Finch found him. I just listened." "You knew what to listen for." Marin watched the tree line. "Your father kept good records. Good records mean a good lawyer who knew those records. A good lawyer who knew those records means someone who also knows they were complete." She paused. "The chain isn't complicated. It just requires paying attention to each link." Seth was quiet again. Then, without looking at her, "He used to whistle. My father. Working the fence line, mending tack, always whistling something badly off-key. My mother used to tease him about it." A pause. "After she died, he stopped for almost a year. First time I heard it start up again out by the south pasture, I nearly cried right there in the saddle. Terrible off-key whistling, and I'd never been so glad to hear anything in my life." Marin let that sit for a moment, the way important things needed to sit. "He sounds like a man who loved deeply," she said. "Both at once, always. That was the only way he knew how to do anything. Seth's hands were easy on the reins, but something in his face had opened slightly, the careful armor of the past 4 days coming back a fraction. I worry sometimes I don't have that in me anymore. The deep feeling. 2 years of just trying to survive, keep the cattle fed, the bills paid. I don't know if I've left myself room. Marin considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. A man who has spent 2 years fighting to hold something his father built. She said at last, rather than simply walking away from it, that man has deep feeling. He just hasn't had the time to notice it's still there. Seth didn't answer. But something in the set of his shoulders changed the way something changes when a weight shifts rather than lifts, still there but differently balanced. The petition went before Judge Marsh 2 days later. The courtroom was the size of a large parlor with hard wooden benches and a window that faced north and let in light without warmth. Druce sat across the room in a coat that had cost more than most men in Millhaven made in a month, composed and correct with the specific composure of a man who has never seriously expected to lose anything. The judge was a dry, gray-haired man with the careful eyes of someone who had seen enough law to stop being impressed by performances and had started caring only about facts. He read the petition, looked at both parties over his spectacles, and asked Druce if he objected. Druce's lawyer rose to offer several objections, well-phrased and professionally delivered, and paper-thin. The judge listened to all of them and overruled each one with the efficiency of a man clearing his desk. Access granted. The document would go to Dr. Silas Oram in Helena within the week. Findings to be presented at the formal hearing date to be set. Outside the courthouse, Druce fell into step beside them on the boardwalk. The public composure was still intact, but something beneath it had pulled tighter like a knot that someone has been working at from the wrong direction. "You think this helps you?" he said. His voice was lower than it had been at the church. The neighborly warmth was gone entirely. "I've built this town for 8 years, Mrs. Calloway. Every debt, every account, every merchant who knows which side his bread is buttered. You think one document examiner changes that?" "I think," Marin said, holding his gaze without effort, "that if your document is everything you claim it is, an examination should give you nothing to worry about." She walked away before he could answer. Seth fell into step beside her, and she felt rather than saw the look he gave her, the same recalibrating look, but warmer now, with something underneath it that had not been there a week ago. It was Blythe who brought the news that collapsed the waiting. Day 9, just after dark. She arrived at the ranch on a borrowed mule, breathless, her bonnet half undone from the speed of the ride. She had been dusting the hallway outside the back parlor at the boarding house when Druce and another man spoke in low voices behind the half-open door. Druce had sent someone to Helena. That night. Fast coach double fare. The man's instructions, as near as Blythe had been able to hear, were to find Dr. Silas Oram and offer him $500 to certify the document as genuine without conducting the examination. The yard went very still when she finished. "How long ago did he leave?" Seth asked. "An hour before I did, riding hard." Rupe said what they were all thinking. "Helena is a day-and-a-half hard ride. We can't catch a man with an hour's lead on a willing horse." "We don't need to catch him," Marin said. She was already moving toward the house. The telegraph office in Millhaven closed at 6, but the operator, a heavy-set man named Garfield, lived in the 2 rooms above it and could be roused for emergencies, provided the emergency came with coin for the trouble. Seth hammered on the door while Marin stood in the dark street composing the message in her head, stripping it down to the words that mattered the way she stripped a pattern down to the essential lines before she started cutting. Garfield opened the door in his nightshirt, saw Seth Calloway's face, and did not waste time on complaints. Marin dictated. Garfield's hands moved over the key with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom the machine had become an extension of thought. The message went out into the dark, toward Helena, a warning to Dr. Silas Oram that a man was coming to him tonight with money to buy a result before he had conducted his examination, and a request that whatever approach was made be noted carefully in the court record. On the ride back to the ranch, a figure detached itself from the shadow of the alley across from the telegraph office. There and then not there, just the impression of a man who had been standing still long enough to have been watching for some time. Seth's voice went low and flat. "Get in the wagon, Maren. Now." She got in. He climbed up beside her, and they drove in silence for the first quarter-mile, both of them listening to the dark. "One of his men," Maren said when the lights of town had fallen well behind them. "Yes. He knows we sent the wire." "Yes." "Then he'll try to reach Oram before it's delivered." Seth's hands were steady on the reins, but his jaw was set in a way she recognized now. "And we've done what we can do tonight. The rest is Oram's integrity." The reply came on day 11, carried by Roop from town at a pace that suggested he had been riding faster than strictly necessary, which for Rupe meant the news was good. Dr. Silas Oram's return wire was precise, economical, and devastating in its restraint. A man had arrived the previous evening with an offer of $500 to certify the document as genuine without examination. Oram had refused. He had noted the time and circumstances in writing, signed, and witnessed. He would proceed with the examination as scheduled. He added with the cool professional satisfaction of a man who considers his independence a matter of principle rather than mere preference. Such approaches only confirm that something worth hiding exists. Seth read it twice. Then he laughed, the short, startled laugh of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just set it down for a moment. "He turned it down," Seth said. "He turned it down." Rupe confirmed with the air of a man who has spent several days not allowing himself to hope and is now revising that position. "It's not just a refusal," Maren said, reading over Seth's shoulder. "He recorded it. A judge looking at this case will now know that Druce attempted to buy the result before the examination even happened." She set the wire on the table carefully. "Whatever Oram finds in that document, Druce has already shown the court how afraid he is of an honest look." 5 days of waiting followed. The ranch moved around them cattle, to be checked, fenced, to be ridden, the ordinary weight of an ordinary operation, pressing forward, regardless of what was happening in courtrooms and telegraph offices and the back parlors of boarding houses. Maren finished the curtains and hung them herself, standing on a chair in the kitchen with the blue cloth, catching the morning light in a way that made Mrs. Dolan stop in the doorway and look at them for a long time without speaking. "Thomas's wife sewed the first set of these," Mrs. Dolan said finally. "Gerald's wife, I mean. Years back. I remember when she hung them." She didn't say anything else, but she reached up and smoothed one panel with a gesture of such uncharacteristic tenderness that Maren had to look away and find something else to do with her hands. It was on day 17 that Thaddeus Garr arrived. He was a rancher of about 45, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something older than his years, and he came to the ranch in the late afternoon with the particular bearing of a man who has spent days working up to something and is afraid that if he doesn't say it now, he never will. His note, he said, had come due. A year early, without warning. With a clause he had signed, or was told he had signed, that he did not remember agreeing to requiring full repayment within 30 days or forfeiture of his eastern grazing allotment. Maren asked to see the paperwork. She spread it on the kitchen table alongside Gerald Calloway's note from Druce's bank and the photostat copy she had made of it at the courthouse. She looked at both documents for a long time. Then she looked at them again, the way she looked at fabric when she was not yet certain what she was seeing, tilting her head slightly, moving the lamp, letting her eyes go soft and then sharp again. The handwriting on the loan documents Druce's bank sealed, the formal clauses, the signature notations was identical, not similar, not written by people trained in the same style. Identical down to the precise evenness of the letter spacing and the specific way the capital letters sat at the top of their lines. A real clerk's hand drifted day to day. Faster some days, more careful on others. Tired on Friday afternoons, precise on Monday mornings. Natural handwriting was never perfectly consistent because human beings were never perfectly consistent. These documents were perfectly consistent. Across what were supposed to be different years, different transactions, different circumstances. One hand. One person. Writing everything. She did not say this aloud yet. She set Thaddeus Garr's papers aside carefully and looked at him. Do you know if anyone else in the county has had something similar happen? A note called early. A clause that appeared that wasn't there before. Gar was quiet for a moment. My cousin, he said slowly, lost his spread 2 years back. Said the same thing note came due early papers he didn't remember signing. We all figured he'd been careless. His face had changed. Something was working itself out behind his eyes. Nobody ever put it together like that. Go home, Marin said. Ask your cousin if he kept any copies of what he originally signed. Bring whatever he has. She paused. And ask yourself who else you know that this might have happened to. Gar left. By the time the sun had gone down and come back up again, 2 more people had arrived at the ranch. Cecily Prout, a widow of about 50 with red-rimmed eyes and a stack of papers held against her chest as though someone might try to take them, and Arvid Wynne, 24 years old there in place of his father, who was too ashamed to come himself. Marin put everything on the kitchen table. 4 sets of documents, 4 families, supposed to represent 4 separate transactions across 3 years handled by different clerks on different days under different circumstances. The handwriting was the same, all of it. Every formal clause, every bank notation, every carefully constructed fraudulent addition, one person had written all of it. Consistently, precisely, with the unnatural evenness of someone using a method that removed the human variation that real handwriting always carried. The kitchen was very quiet. Cecily Prout was the first to speak. 6 years, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. 6 years I've been telling myself I should have read more carefully. Should have understood what I was signing after my husband died. Should have been smarter. Her hands were shaking slightly on the table. It was never my fault. No, Marin said. It never was. Arvid Wynne's jaw was tight with the controlled anger of a young man who has just understood something that explains 3 years of watching his father blame himself. He said nothing, but his silence had the texture of someone making a decision. Thaddeus Gar looked at the documents, then at Marin. He's been doing this for years, to all of us. And every one of you stayed quiet, Marin said without judgment. Because every one of you thought you were the only one it happened to. Because shame is a wall as strong as fear, and Druce built his whole operation on both. She looked at the 4 faces around her kitchen table, frightened, furious, and no longer alone in either. He never imagined you'd all end up under the same roof comparing the same handwriting. That night, Marin sat with Seth in the kitchen long after the others had gone, the documents still spread between them on the table. Outside, the October wind had sharpened into something with genuine intent behind it, coming down off the mountains with the first real cold of the season. It's bigger than us, Seth said quietly. He was looking at the spread of papers with the expression of a man watching something he thought was a single wound reveal itself as something that had been going on for a very long time. It was always bigger than us, Marin said. We just didn't know it yet. Seth was quiet. Then, what happens if Oram comes back wrong? If the judge doesn't believe Pryor? If Druce has someone we don't know about? Marin did not offer him false comfort. She had never done that for anyone, and she was not going to begin now with this man in this kitchen with this much at stake. Then we lose the ranch, she said, and we fight whatever comes after that. She met his eyes. But we're not there yet. We're here, with 4 families who all have the same impossible handwriting on documents that were supposed to be written by different people. That's not a small thing, Seth. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over and held on. They sat like that for a long while in the warmth of the kitchen while the wind made its cold argument against the windows and the ranch waited around them in the dark. And then just at the edge of sleep, Marin smelled it. Not the wood smoke of the hearth, something sharper, something wrong. She was at the window before the thought had finished forming, and what she saw on the east side of the yard stopped her breath entirely. The barn was on fire. Not catching fire. Already burning, the kind of burning that meant it had started at more than one point, that someone had planned this, that the flames at the base of the east wall, in the corner of the hayloft, and the far side of the equipment lean-to had not arrived together by accident. She was out the door before Seth reached the window. She heard herself shouting his name, heard Roop's voice from the bunkhouse, heard the horses screaming inside the barn in the particular way that horses scream when the air is going wrong around them, a sound that hit the chest like something physical. Seth came off the porch at a dead run. He took one look at the 3 separate burn points and understood what Maren already understood. He wrapped his arm in his coat and reached for the barn door. "Seth." Her voice came out with everything in it, the fear she had been carrying for 18 days, the thing she had not let herself say, the one calculation she had refused to make because making it meant admitting it was possible. He stopped. "You have a wife," she said. Her voice did not shake because she would not let it. "Don't you dare go back in there." He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "The horses matter. The hay matters. The barn matters. None of it matters the way you matter. Not to me. Not for one single second." Above them, the roof beam gave a long, grinding crack. A section of the hayloft came down in a cascade of sparks and flaming straw, and Roop appeared from the darkness and grabbed Seth's arm and pulled him back, and the decision was made by physics, if not by will. They fought the fire with buckets for 2 hours. Every hand on the ranch a chain to the well working until their arms failed, and someone else took their place. By the time the flames died to smoking embers, 2 horses were lost, and the east wall was gone, and the hay store that was supposed to carry the cattle through January was black ash and ruin. In the gray hour before dawn, Rupi walked the perimeter of what remained and crouched at the tree line and found what he was looking for. He carried it back and set it on the ground in front of Seth, without speaking. A kerosene tin, tossed into the brush in the hurry of someone who had expected the fire to consume everything, including the evidence of how it started. Not careful enough. Not careful because someone had not expected anyone to look closely enough to find it. Seth looked at the tin for a long time. "He's done with paper," Rupe said. Seth nodded slowly, the ash still on his face, the dawn coming up cold and gray over the ruin of the barn. Maren stood beside him and looked at what was left. Druce had spent 8 years building his kingdom with forged documents and cold debts and the careful management of who owed what to whom. He had done it quietly, patiently, with the confidence of a man who had never once been seriously looked at. She had been looking at him for 18 days, and now he was burning things down, which meant he was afraid, which meant the examination was going to find what she knew it was going to find, which meant everything she had done since the night she held that document up to the lamp and saw the ink that was too black and too even and too new, everything was going to matter. The tin sat on the ground between them in the first gray light. The hearing was 6 days away. The morning after the fire, the ranch smelled of ash and cold. It was the kind of cold that came down off the mountains in late October with the specific intention of reminding you that the land did not care about your plans or your troubles or the things you had built and lost. The cottonwoods along the eastern fence line had gone bare overnight or seemed to have the last of their leaves pulled away by the same wind that had fed the flames. What remained of the barn stood against the gray sky like something that had given up. Seth was already in the yard when Maren came out, standing at the edge of what had been the east wall with his arms at his sides and his hat in his hands. She had come to recognize that posture, the hat always the hat held in both hands when he was working something through that he hadn't yet found words for. Rupe was crouched near the tree line with Sheriff Amos Trell, both of them looking at the kerosene tin in the frost-stiffened grass. Trell had arrived before 7, which told Maren that Roop had sent for him before dawn, which told her that Roop had not slept. Trell walked the perimeter of the burn in the methodical way of a man who has learned that what you find at the edges of a fire tells you more than what you find at the center. He crouched at each of the 3 starting points. He stood and looked at the spacing between them. He looked at the tin. "Whoever did this wasn't careful," he said finally. "Or didn't expect to need to be. Find out whose tin it is," Seth said. His voice was quiet and controlled in the specific way that meant he was holding something back. by deliberate effort. "Please, Sheriff, I don't care how long it takes." Trell nodded. He wrapped the tin in his coat and carried it to his horse with the care of a man who has just decided something matters. It took 3 days. 3 days that Maren filled the way. She filled all difficult time with work, because work was the one thing that could not be taken from her by waiting. She finished cataloging the last of Gerald's ledgers and started a new record of her own, a cross-reference of the 4 families' documents laid against the timeline she had reconstructed from Gerald's papers. She cooked alongside Mrs. Dolan, who had stopped positioning herself neutrally between welcome and hostility and had moved without announcement to simply making room. She cut and sewed the last of the curtains for the upstairs rooms and hung them herself because the house was going to be whole even if the barn was not. Seth worked the wreckage. He and Roop assessed what could be salvaged from the east wall shored up the west end that was still standing, covered what remained of the equipment with canvas against the coming weather. He worked from first light until after dark, the way he always worked, when he was carrying something he couldn't put down, and Maren watched this and understood it and did not try to make him stop. On the second evening, she brought coffee out to where he was working in the cold and sat on an overturned water trough and did not say anything, and after a while he sat down beside her and they watched the last light go out of the sky over the mountains. "My father built that barn the year I was born," he said. Maren did not say anything. He and 2 neighbors and a man he hired from Billings. Took them 11 days. He used to tell that story, how on the 8th day the roof beam split and they thought they'd have to start over. And how my mother brought lunch out and looked at the split beam and said it just needed a sister beam alongside it, and she was right. A pause. He told that story every time someone said a problem was unfixable. Said the answer was usually right there if you looked at it from a different angle. Maren looked at the sky. He sounds like someone who paid attention to things. He paid attention to everything. Seth wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I keep thinking about what you said, that the strongest people are the ones who had to fight for every inch." He was quiet for a moment. "He fought for every inch of this place, 30 years of it, and I've been sitting here for 2 years feeling like I'm losing it all and there's nothing I can do." "You haven't lost it," Maren said. "Not yet." "Not yet," she agreed. "And not if I have anything to say about it." He looked at her then in the last gray light with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the recalibrating assessment she had come to know, not the careful guardedness of a man who had been hurt and was protecting the wound. Something more open than that, something that did not have a defensive layer over it. He said simply, "I'm glad you didn't get back on that train." Maren looked at her coffee. "So am I," she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her with its completeness. It was Blythe who broke the case open as she had broken things open before arriving on the 3rd day on her borrowed mule, with the particular expression of someone carrying news they have been sitting on just long enough to confirm it is real. A man named Dolan Grisp worked as a clerk at Druce's bank. He had worked there for 4 years, handling document preparation and filing a quiet and unremarkable presence that no one paid particular attention to. He drank as unremarkable men sometimes did more than was wise. And 2 nights ago, deep enough into his cups at the Millhaven saloon that his judgment had abandoned him entirely. He had told the man beside him at the bar about a job that had earned him $50. A job out at the Calloway place. A job involving kerosene and a dry night and 3 points along the barn wall that would catch and hold. The bartender had heard every word. The bartender had told his wife. His wife had told Blythe's mother. Blythe's mother had told Blythe at breakfast, and Blythe had been on the mule within the hour. Sheriff Trell had Dolan Grisp in custody before noon. Grisp was not a man built for silence under pressure. He confessed within 10 minutes of the first direct question with the relieved speed of someone who has been carrying a secret that was too heavy for him from the moment he agreed to carry it. He named Franklin Druce without hesitation. He described the instructions, the $50, the specific points along the barn wall he had been told to start. He had done exactly what he was told. He had not thought much about what it meant until after, when the thinking about it had made him drink more. And the drinking more had made him talk. Trell brought this news to the ranch himself in the early afternoon with a gravity in his bearing that had not been there on previous visits. "Arson," he said, standing in the Calloway kitchen with his hat in his hands. "On top of the forgery and the fraudulent claim, with a direct confession naming Druce as the one who ordered it." He looked at Seth. "I'll need a warrant for his arrest. That means going back to Judge Marsh. Tonight, if the judge will see me." "He'll see you," Seth said. Something had shifted in his voice. The controlled flatness was gone, replaced by something steadier and colder and more final. "Druce set fire to my father's barn. He did it to frighten us off a court hearing. I want him in a cell before that hearing opens." Trell left within the hour. By the time the sun was down, word had come back from Judge Marsh's office warrant issued. The arson charge added to the existing forgery claim, and the documented attempt to bribe Dr. Oram had persuaded the judge that Franklin Druce was not a man who should be walking free with a court date approaching. Druce was arrested that night. Blythe, who witnessed it from the boarding house porch, reported the next morning that he had not gone quietly. That the composure he had worn for 8 years like a second coat had come apart entirely in the moment the deputy's hand closed on his arm. That he had said loudly enough for the street to hear that this was not over, that a seamstress from Ohio had no right to what she had done, that he had built this town and it owed him more than this. Maren heard this and felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly. The specific quietness that comes when a thing that has been happening in the dark is finally happening in the open where it can be properly seen and properly dealt with. The hearing was set for day 25. The night before, Maren could not sleep. She lay in the dark beside Seth and listened to the wind work against the house and ran through everything, every document, every testimony, every link in the chain she had been building for 3 weeks, and looked for the places where it could break. "You're not sleeping," Seth said into the darkness. "No, neither am I." She turned toward him. In the dark, his face was a shape she knew now by memory rather than sight. The line of his jaw, the way he held himself even at rest with a certain readiness, the man he was when no one was watching. "Tell me what you're afraid of," he said. It was the right question. She had spent 28 years presenting steadiness, whether she felt it or not, because the world had taught her that steadiness was what earned you the right to be taken seriously. But this was the dark, and this was Seth, and he had asked directly. "I'm afraid Oram finds something equivocal," she said. "Something that gives Druce's lawyer enough to argue with. I'm afraid the judge gives more weight to a notarized document than to the testimony of a man Druce has already publicly ruined once." She paused. "I'm afraid we've built something strong, and it still won't be strong enough." Seth was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say," he said slowly, "that the only honest thing a man can do before a hard day is acknowledge that he can't control the outcome, that the work was his to do. The result wasn't." Maren looked at the ceiling. "We've done the work," she said. "We've done the work," he agreed. He took her hand in the dark. She held on. In the morning, she dressed in the deep blue wool she had worn on her wedding day. It was a deliberate choice. She had made that dress herself, cut every piece set, every seam, pressed every edge. It was the most precise thing she owned. It was the right thing to wear to a day that required precision. Seth wore his father's coat. The courtroom was full in a way that Roop said he had never seen in 20 years of living in Millhaven. Every bench was packed. People stood along the back wall. Maren recognized faces she had come to know over 3 weeks. Arlo Finch from the Mercantile with his ink-stained fingers and his careful eyes. Blythe perched near the front beside Mrs. Calder, who had apparently decided that whatever opinion she held about the new Mrs. Calloway, they were insufficient reason to miss this. Thaddeus Garr and his wife. Cecily Prout alone but straight-backed. Arvid Wynne, beside an older man who had his son's jaw and his son's careful stillness, his father who had been too ashamed to come himself and had come anyway. Franklin Druce sat at the front with his lawyer. 2 nights in a cell had not improved his composure. The coat was right, the posture was right. But something in the set of his face had changed. The absolute confidence of a man who has never seriously imagined losing had been replaced by something more calculated and more fragile, the performed confidence of a man who has decided to act as though he has not lost already. Judge Marsh settled behind his bench with the unhurried gravity of a man who understood that what happened in the next several hours would be talked about in this county for a long time, and who intended to make sure it was talked about correctly. Dr. Silas Oram took the stand first. He was a precise, compact man of about 50, with the careful stillness of someone accustomed to looking at things very closely before speaking about them. He stated his qualifications without vanity. Years of document examination cases across 3 territories. The specific technical training that allowed him to assess ink composition, paper aging, and handwriting characteristics in ways that went beyond what the eye alone could determine. He had examined the document presented as a loan agreement between Gerald Calloway and the Millhaven Territorial Bank dated July 1879. He had found it to be a forgery. He said this in the same measured tone he had used for everything else, which somehow made it land harder than any dramatic announcement could have. The courtroom absorbed it in silence, the specific silence of a word settling into the air and being understood. The ink was inconsistent with a document 4 years old. Iron gall ink of the type used underwent predictable chemical changes over time, a gradual oxidation, a fading at the edges, a particular feathering of pigment into paper grain that could not be artificially replicated without leaving its own chemical signature. This document showed none of those characteristics. The ink was fresh. Not 4 years old, not 2 years old, months at most. The handwriting was not natural. A genuine signature showed micro variations, slight changes in pressure, minor inconsistencies in letter formation. The small human imprecision that existed in every real act of writing. This signature showed no such variations. The stroke width was perfectly consistent. The pen lift patterns were absent in places where they would always appear in a naturally written signature. The letter forms were precise in a way that human hands, even practiced ones, did not achieve without mechanical assistance. The document had been traced. Not written, traced from an existing genuine signature using a method that allowed the copier to reproduce the general shape of the original while losing the small human variations that made it real. Druce's lawyer cross-examined with the determined energy of a man trying to find solid ground that wasn't there. He suggested unusual storage conditions. He suggested unusual consistency in Gerald Calloway's hand. He suggested that Dr. Oram's methods were not universally accepted. Oram answered each question with the patient precision of someone who had testified in enough courtrooms to have heard all of these questions before. He did not become irritated. He did not overstate. He simply continued to be exactly as certain as he was, which was very certain, and declined to become more or less certain based on how the questions were phrased. At the end of the cross-examination, Druce's lawyer asked whether Oram would stake his professional reputation on his findings. Oram said that he already had by signing his name to them. The courtroom was very quiet. Aldous Pryor took the stand next. He walked to it differently than he had walked into any room Marin had seen him in, upright in a way that was no longer effortful, deliberate in a way that had purpose behind it rather than careful management of how he appeared. 6 years of diminishment, Marin thought, and underneath it, the man he had been before Druce had decided he needed to be reduced. He stated his role in the preparation of Gerald Calloway's will. He stated the date, April of 1879, 3 months before the date on the loan document. He described the accounting he had conducted, required by law, of all of Gerald's assets and financial obligations. He stated clearly and without qualification that there had been no loan from the Millhaven Territorial Bank. None of any amount. If it had existed, he would have been legally required to account for it in the will documentation. He had not accounted for it, because it had not existed. Druce's lawyer attempted to undermine this by reference to Pryor's history with Druce. The ruined practice, the lost clients, the departed wife, suggesting that a man with 6 years of grievance could not be trusted to testify honestly. Pryor looked at Druce's lawyer with the level gaze of someone who has had a long time to think about what he would say if this moment ever came. He said that he would swear to his testimony even if he felt nothing toward Druce at all, because his feelings about the man had nothing to do with the accuracy of a legal accounting he had performed 3 months before any dispute existed. He said that if the lawyer wished to suggest he had falsified a will document in 1879 in anticipation of a courtroom in 1883, he would be interested to hear that theory developed in more detail. Something that was almost laughter moved through the gallery before Judge Marsh's gavel quieted it. Thaddeus Garr testified. He described the clause that had appeared in his note, the acceleration of the repayment schedule, the amount he had not agreed to. He held the rail with both hands, and his voice shook in the first 30 seconds, and then steadied. And he told the truth plainly and without ornamentation, the way a man does when he has decided that the only thing left to lose is his own account of what happened. Cecily Prout followed. She described the renegotiated terms on her dairy operation, the clauses she had not signed, the shame she had carried for 6 years, believing the fault was hers for not reading carefully enough after her husband died. Her composure held for most of it. It broke at the end briefly when she said that her husband had considered Druce a friend and had died, not knowing what had been done to his widow in the years after. Arvid Wynne spoke for his father. He was 24 years old, and he was angry in the clean, clear way of someone who has understood something fully and decided what he thinks about it. He described 3 years of watching his father blame himself for a debt that had changed shape overnight. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Marin watched Druce's face through all of it. The composure held through Oram's testimony. It held through Pryor's. It held through most of Garr's. By the time Cecily Prout took the stand, it had developed a quality of rigidity, the composure that is no longer natural, but is being produced by conscious effort, the way a structure holds past the point it should fail, because all its remaining strength is concentrated on holding. And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 men came in. One was a deputy sheriff from the territorial marshal's office, dusty from hard riding, with the look of a man who had not stopped for anything since receiving his orders. The other was a thin, gray-faced man of about 35, with his hands bound in front of him and the particular expression of someone who has just spent a day and a half reconsidering every decision that led to this moment. Dolan Grisp. He had been apprehended at the territorial boundary. The deputy had been authorized to retrieve him the moment Druce's arrest, and the forgery testimony made it clear that the bank clerk's disappearance was not coincidental. He had not resisted. He had, by the deputy's account, seemed almost relieved. Judge Marsh looked at Grisp for a long moment. He explained in the measured tone of a man who carries authority so naturally he does not need to perform it, that a material witness to criminal proceedings did not have the right to leave the territory once those proceedings had begun. He explained the penalties for perjury. He noted that the witness had already confessed to arson, and that the court had a record of that confession, and that anything Grisp said today that contradicted that confession would be treated accordingly. Then he asked Grisp plainly whether he had forged the documents presented in this case. The courtroom held its breath. Grisp looked at Druce. It was the look of a man who has spent years believing that loyalty would flow in both directions, that the arrangement had obligations on both sides. Druce did not look back. He was looking at the table in front of him with the fixed attention of a man who has decided that what is happening in this room is not happening. That refusal broke something in Grisp. Marin watched it happen, the small collapse, the realization arriving in his face that he had been entirely alone in this from the beginning, that the man who had hired him and directed him and paid him $50 to burn a barn had no intention of bearing any of the weight of what came next. "Yes," Grisp said. His voice was thin but clear. "Yes, I forged all of it, every document, Gerald Calloway's signature and the others, on Mr. Druce's instruction." The courtroom did not erupt. It did something more absolute than that. It went completely silent, the silence of something landing that everyone present had suspected and none had been certain of until this second. Judge Marsh let the silence hold for a moment, as though he understood that it was doing necessary work. Then he asked Grisp to continue. Grisp continued. He described the arrangement 4 years ago when his gambling debts had reached the point where Druce's offer had seemed like the only available door. He described the method the bank's own records, genuine documents bearing Gerald Calloway's real signature on legitimate transactions from years past, a light table, weeks of practice until his hand had learned the shape of the letters well enough to reproduce them at the size and pace that a real signature required. He described doing the same with other ranchers' signatures. The same process, the same light table, the same practice, the same careful production of documents that would look at a glance like legitimate bank records. He had not imagined anyone would look closely enough to find what a light table could not fix. The things that made a forged signature wrong were not the things that were visible to an ordinary eye. They required a specific kind of looking patient, technical, the kind of attention that most people in a small Montana town in 1883 had no reason to bring to a bank document. Most people. The judge said, "You stated the forgeries were conducted on Mr. Druce's instruction. Is that accurate?" "Yes," Grisp said. "Everyone. He told me which accounts, which amounts, which clauses to add. I wrote what he told me to write." In the front of the courtroom, Franklin Druce said nothing. He had not moved since Grisp had walked through the door. His lawyer leaned close and spoke in a low voice, and Druce did not appear to hear him. Judge Marsh's gavel came down with a sound that was final in the way of things that cannot be undone. The fraudulent claim against the Calloway property was dismissed in its entirety. The land was Seth Calloway's, encumbered by no debt to the Millhaven Territorial Bank, which had never held a legitimate claim against it. The matter of criminal fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and arson was referred to the territorial prosecutor with the court's strong recommendation that it be treated as a matter of urgent priority. Franklin Druce and Dolan Grisp were to remain in custody pending that prosecution, with bail to be set at the court's discretion. Seth's hand found Marin's under the table. She held on and did not let go. Druce was led out through the side door. At the threshold, he turned back and looked at Marin with an expression that was not the look of a beaten man. It was the look of a man still calculating, still searching for the angle he had not yet used. Marin held his gaze until the door closed. She knew what that look meant. Men like Druce did not stop because they had lost. They regrouped. They looked for the last remaining pressure point, the one threat they hadn't yet spent. She was not surprised when on day 28, Thaddeus Garr arrived at the ranch with a new document in his hand, a civil suit filed by Druce's lawyer from his jail cell, claiming that Garr had conspired to fabricate evidence and demanding damages that would effectively freeze his assets until the claim was resolved. Garr's face had the specific look of a man who had found the courage to stand up and has just been shown clearly and deliberately what the cost of standing up can be. "He doesn't need to win it," Marin said when Garr had finished explaining. "He needs to file it. He needs you to be looking at a lawsuit and legal fees and months of uncertainty, and then he needs you to decide that the quiet life you had before was better than this." "Maybe he's right," Garr said. The bitterness in it was not directed at Marin. It was the bitterness of someone who wanted to be braver than circumstances were making it easy to be. "He's not right," Seth said. He said it quietly and with a certainty that did not require volume. "You told the truth. That matters regardless of what he files." Marin was already thinking. Druce was counting on exhaustion, on the slow grinding weight of uncertainty and legal costs and the attrition of hope. He had done this before, not with lawsuits, but with cold notes and accelerated terms and the pressure of debt applied at precisely the point where a person was least able to absorb it. He was good at it. He had been doing it for years. The answer was not a lawyer. They did not have the money for a legal fight across multiple civil claims, and Druce knew it. The answer was not patience. Druce had more resources to outlast them than they had to outlast him. The answer was daylight. She sat at Gerald's desk that night and wrote. She wrote clearly in the plain, direct language she used for everything, without rhetoric or appeal to emotion, because the facts themselves were sufficiently damning that rhetoric would only dilute them. She described what had happened, the forged documents, the multiple families, the confession, the arson. She described the civil suit filed from a jail cell by a man awaiting criminal prosecution for the crimes the civil suit was attempting to obscure. She described Dolan Grisp saying in open court, before a full gallery, and a territorial judge, that he had never imagined anyone would look closely enough to find what he had done. She sent it to the Helena Territorial Gazette, signed by all 4 families, witnessed by Aldous Pryor. Roop carried it personally on the fastest horse on the property, with instructions not to stop until it was in the editor's hand. On day 35, the story ran on the front page. Rupe came back with a copy and set it on the kitchen table without speaking. Seth read it once, then again. Marin read it standing beside him, noting what the reporter had found beyond their letter. 2 additional families who had come forward since the trial testimony became public people who had been sitting with their shame for years and had needed to see that others had spoken before they could speak themselves. 6 families now, not 4. Within a week, Druce's civil suit against Thaddeus Garr was quietly withdrawn. No explanation offered, though no explanation was required. A public spotlight made frivolous intimidation significantly less appealing. The territorial prosecutor's office set a criminal trial date 6 weeks out, faster than anyone had expected given the office's usual pace. The front page had apparently done what Marin had calculated it would do, made the slower option more costly than the faster one. On day 40, the barn frame went up. Thaddeus Garr came with his 2 eldest sons and a team of horses. Arvid Wynne came with his father, who was a large, weathered man of 60 or so, who said almost nothing but worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been doing physical labor his whole life and still finds it the most honest way to express what he means. Arlo Finch came, which surprised Marin, and did not leave until the last timber was seated. Even Aldous Pryor came. He was not a man who had done much physical labor in recent years, and his contribution was mostly handing things to people who needed them and holding boards steady while others drove the nails. But he was there at 62 in the cold October air, with sawdust on his coat and something in his face that had not been there when they first sat in his cabin 3 weeks ago. Something that looked like a man who had gotten part of himself back and intended to keep it. Cecily Prout came in the late afternoon with food enough for twice the number of people working. She set it out on a table near the new frame and did not make a production of it, which Marin understood was her way. When the work was done and the frame stood against the evening sky, raw timber, not yet roofed, but solid and square and real. The gathered people stood and looked at it for a moment in the quiet way of people who have done something together and know it. On day 42, Cecily sat with Marin on the porch in the thin autumn sunlight, both of them with coffee, neither of them in a hurry. "I don't know how to thank you properly," Cecily said, "for seeing what the rest of us couldn't, or wouldn't." "You walked into that courtroom and told the truth," Marin said. "That took more than anything I did with a lamp and a ledger." "I think," Cecily said slowly, "it took both. Someone had to look closely enough to make the speaking worth the risk, and someone had to speak." She was quiet for a moment. "This town owes you something it won't know how to say." Marin watched the mountains. The first real snow had come overnight, dusting the high peaks in a way that would not leave now until spring. "I didn't come here to be owed anything," she said. "I came here because a man wrote me 6 months of honest letters, and I thought that was worth the train ticket." Cecily smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached fully into a face and changed it. "And was it?" Marin considered the ranch spread before her, the new barn frame against the white-capped mountains. The kitchen garden she had cleared and would plant in the spring. The curtains she had hung in every window. The ledgers she had read and organized and made into evidence the people sitting around at tables. They had been sitting around separately until 3 weeks ago. "Yes," she said, "it was." It was on the evening of day 43 that Seth found her in the barn. She was running her hand along one of the new timbers, feeling the grain of the fresh-cut wood, the particular solidity of something recently made. The barn smelled of pine sap and cold air, and the good, clean smell of new lumber. A lantern hung from a hook near the door and threw warm light across the raw walls. Seth stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. When she turned, he had an expression she had not seen from him before. None of the layers she had been learning to read, none of the careful management of what he allowed to show. Just a man looking at his wife in the light. He came across the barn floor and stood in front of her. "I think about that platform," he said. "The man I was in those first 10 seconds looking at a photograph instead of you. I've apologized for it, but I want to say something else." Marin waited. "I'm grateful for it," he said. "Grateful I was fool enough to nearly lose you in the first 10 seconds. Because it means I've spent every day since then learning exactly who you actually are, instead of the picture I'd built in my head." He looked at her steadily, the way she had asked him to on their second morning, the way he had been learning to do ever since. "I wrote that advertisement for a woman who could sew curtains and keep a quiet house. I ended up married to a woman who can read a forged signature by lamplight and organize half a territory into a case against a man who had been stealing from them for years." A pause. "I don't know how to account for that kind of luck." Marin looked at him in the lantern light. She had spent 28 years in rooms where people had decided what she was before she said a word. She had spent 28 years arriving anyway, doing the work anyway, being exactly herself without apology, because the alternative was to become someone smaller. And she had never been willing to do that. She had not come to Millhaven expecting anything beyond what the letters had offered, a practical arrangement with a man who seemed honest. She had not expected the rest of it. "I love you," Seth said. "I should have said that plainly before now. I love you, not who I imagined. You exactly as you are." Marin felt something release in her chest, something she had not known she was holding. A long tension in a place she had not realized was tense, the particular armor of a woman who has learned not to expect to be seen completely and has organized her whole self around that expectation. "I love you too, Seth Calloway," she said. The words came without effort. True and solid, entirely her own. "I came here for a roof over my head and a man who meant what he wrote. I found considerably more than that." He reached out and took her hand. Work rough and scarred from 3 weeks of bucket lines and ledger pages and barn building and everything that had come between the train platform and this moment. Outside, the Montana night had come fully down, cold and clear, the stars hard and bright over the mountains. The new barn stood around them, raw and unfinished and entirely real, built out of what had been lost and what had survived the losing. The criminal trial came 6 weeks later and was in the end shorter than anyone expected. The confession, the testimony, the evidence Marin had assembled across 3 weeks of careful, exhausting work. The jury took less than 2 hours. Guilty on every count. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy, arson. Judge Marsh sentenced Franklin Druce to 15 years in the territorial prison. Full restitution ordered to all 6 families. The Millhaven Territorial Bank was placed under court-appointed management, pending an orderly dissolution and sale to settle what was owed. Dolan Grisp received 7 years reduced in consideration of his cooperation. He did not look at Druce when the sentence was read. Druce did not look at anyone. Marin sat beside Seth in the courtroom and watched Druce's face when the gavel came down for the last time. She was looking for something specific, some final expression, some last revelation of the man underneath the 8 years of performance. What she found was less dramatic than that. Just a face going slack. Just the particular emptiness of a man who has run out of moves. She felt no cruelty. She felt no triumph exactly. She felt the quiet, solid, specific satisfaction of work completed correctly. On the ride home, with the mountains going pink in the late afternoon light and the frost on the grass catching the sun like scattered glass. Seth drove in silence for a while, and Marin sat beside him and watched the land go by. The land that was theirs. 400 acres of Montana prairie that Gerald Calloway had built from nothing, and that his son had held together through 2 years of grief and threat and the kind of loneliness that comes from fighting something too large to fight alone. Not alone anymore. "My father would have liked you," Seth said without looking away from the road. "He always said the strongest people weren't the ones born lucky. They were the ones who had to fight for every inch and never once stopped." Marin watched the mountains. "Then we have that in common," she said. "Your father and I." Seth smiled. It reached his eyes in the way that his smiles did when they were real, which she had learned to recognize as a thing worth watching for. The horses found their rhythm on the familiar road. The ranch came into view around the last bend, the house with its new curtains catching the last light in the windows. The new barn frame standing against the sky, the whole of it waiting in the late afternoon like something that intended to stay. She had not come to Millhaven to be chosen. She had not come to prove herself to a town that had laughed at the wrong moment, or a man who had reached for a photograph instead of seeing what was standing in front of him. She had come because the letters were honest, and honest letters were worth a train ticket, and she had never been afraid of hard work or hard country or the kind of life that required everything you had. She had come, and she had looked closely the way she had always looked at everything, at cloth and thread and the dried ink of old documents and the face of a man trying to hide what he was afraid of. And she had found in this cold and enormous country at the edge of the world exactly what she had been without all along. Something worth fighting for, something that held.